That's what this session's all about. I'll say a few words of introduction. I'd like to look at three areas of opportunity because I've been involved with various things over the last year, PG certs and what have you. And it's people have asked about, this, and the theme of this conference is where do we go from here? What can we look at? How can we help the students? Well, these are three areas where I think there's big potential to engage with students, and education developers can help staff engage with students, etc., etc. So I'd like to have a look at those three areas and then discuss as we go along. Please use the chat box as we go along, and I'll try and respond as we go along rather than just leave it all to the end. All these slides will be available. I have too many slides, so I won't discuss all of them in detail, but I'm happy to follow up. So I hope you'll find some of the slides useful. Please borrow them, pillage them, adapt them if you want to, because you will have them shortly. So please use the chat box. All the slides will be available, and let's get cracking. This slide is blatant self-promotion, just some of the things that I've been involved with. Again, if there are any things that on that list that you'd like to have a chat about, please do get in touch. So part one, reflection on the world of work. It seems to me that the world of work is changing. And it seems to me that we now have an opportunity to have dialogue with students, which we didn't have before, because we've all had to wrestle with the demands of the pandemic. We're all looking forward, hopefully, to employment, some sort of career in the future. But what is that going to look like? And here I think we have an interesting question that we can start asking our students. And there are some questions there you might want to think about. What implications does the changing world of work have, not just what students learn, but how students learn? And the image that came to my mind when I started thinking about this was The Graduate. Some of you are old enough to remember the movie The Graduate. Dustin Hoffman as a young graduate at his kind of coming out party at the end of the course, and everyone keeps coming up to him and telling him what he should do, what should his future be. So what now as a career? What would you recommend? What would you say to the young graduate of 2022 or 2021 in terms of what should they do next? I'll leave you to put, and if you would like to put an answer in the chat box, please do, because the answer that came in the Graduate movie was, of course, plastics. That was the future. And it started me thinking about whether we do have careers anymore, in the sense that that people talked about the career anymore. And one of the things I've been collecting over the last few weeks is that column on the right-hand side of the page. Future, what would you recommend as a future-proof career? Is there such a thing? And those are some job titles which I'm not sure that any of my children or what have you, or grandchildren or what have you, have actually come up to me and say, I want to be a cyber pain management advisor when I grow up. And all of these are real job titles. So we have changing trends, and we can now, I think, start talking to students, not just about how the world is changing, but how jobs and employments are changing. And if we say that a lot of graduates will go on to take on professional jobs, then professional practice is changing. And here are two very different accounts of how professions will change over the next 5-10 years. And I've highlighted a couple of those items. There's lots of overlap between those two lists, but this idea from Goodyear and colleague, the growing importance of relational expertise, interprofessional, working with personal skills, working with professional skills, working with other people, Susskind and Susskind, father and son combination, say a shift from reactive to proactive. So in other words, we can't just sit back as a consultant and expect people to come to us. We have to go out in ways that perhaps we didn't have to before. I came across an advert the other day for how to dictate your will to the AI robot, who then processes it into a thing. So I no longer have to go to and see a solicitor anymore at any stage in my life. So there are all these changes in professional practice. And the next point I want to make is, do the tech gurus know where we're going? Does anybody really know where we're going? Nice comment there from Joanne in the chat box. Perhaps we shouldn't advise, yes, we certainly shouldn't have perhaps advised Dustin Hoffman to do what he actually did next. And if you haven't seen that movie, I recommend it. Do the tech gurus know what's going to happen to us, how we're going to use all this bright new technology in our working lives? Here are 4 different scenarios for the future. And you might just like to have a look at those and decide which technological giant is doing those 4 things. Are you working from home part of the time, returning to an office-centric culture, working from home forever, or do you have to go and kowtow to your manager to decide whether you can do it? And that's the answer. Microsoft, Amazon, Twitter, and Google in that order. In other words, they're all doing slightly different things. And the quote that I think perhaps summarizes this is from Facebook. None of us has all this figured out. We are making this up on the fly. And just as I mentioned Amazon, there's today's Amazon delivery. So, you do wonder whether about the surveillance society in that wonderful book on surveillance capitalism. Anyway, I shall move on. So if they're making it up, who's going to decide? And some of the executives have very strong views on this. This is a quote from the Goldman Sachs chief executive, David Solomon. It's an aberration. Teleworking, virtual working, home working is an aberration that we should eliminate. The chaps from Netflix agree. And if you start looking around for other perspectives, other evidence, you have to worry about where this evidence comes from, because there's another, this was taken from BBC News, I think, a couple of days ago. Over the long term, quite hopeful we'll see people return 5 days a week. Then this does come from the Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. So one suspects perhaps a wee bit of a vested interest there. But nonetheless, he does suggest that there's going to be some kind of flexibility. And I saw an estimate yesterday that said that 60% of employers are going to introduce some form of flexibility. So, and if they don't, there's another example from BBC News. Aren't the workers rebelling? Apparently, Apple workers have been rebelling against their chief exec, because the chief exec, and it's interesting that it seems to be all the people in power who are saying this, that we should bring our workers into the office. Perhaps they don't have the same commute that we all do. And then again, of course, you can start asking your students questions about the future direction of the university. I've just put these 2 quotes side by side because a really interesting book by Collini from 2012, who suggested that universities were turning into these kind of money-making machines, the high-ed biz. But the most recent book I've come across on the future of the university is called The New Power University. And there's also, he's also produced a webinar, which is really quite interesting. And you'll see that the language is changing. He talks about universities have a responsibility, much more of a community responsibility, to make their graduates not just employable, but world ready. So we're not just employing them for the big bucks jobs. And in fact, this reflects back on David Kernan's point in the opening keynote yesterday about which jobs are worth more than others. And I mentioned that because it just so happens that this week's tweet chat, this week's LTHE chat, is all about rethinking responsibility, the role of higher education. And I just popped that slide in to recommend that you go along to that, because I'm certainly going to see where our universities might be heading, because they may well be heading in very different directions. And implications for investigative practice, for educational practice. So if you have all these variable work patterns and what have you, all these changes in professional practices, we now have a potential for projects, for co-creation projects, for interdisciplinary investigation with students, for long-term investigations, where students from perhaps follow it up over a year, starting off in year 1, another group picks it up in year 2, etc., etc. And of course, all sorts of opportunities for publishing outcomes and issues. And if you're interested in that, the whole notion of co-creation, that's my best resource to talk about co-creation if you want to follow up some really interesting work, and lots of examples in that book from Catherine Boville. And a second possibility is, if virtual working is going to become the norm, then shouldn't we be preparing students for that by putting more of it in the course? Because presumably students are going to face different scenarios. I've suggested 4. I say we because this is part of a we handbook for students, which is coming out later. So this is another opportunity for a shameless plug. The students will have to cope with face-to-face interaction, totally online interaction, either or, and some kind of flexible. So the argument there is we need to give students sufficient experience of those things right through their course, as well as the place of ultimate work. And I take David's point that universities are also places of work. So you've got the opportunity for students to investigate the university as a place of work. Okay, so that was part one, this idea that because the world of work is changing so much, people know, in effect, not really where we're going. There's a real opportunity there for students to do real valuable investigations and co-creation. Okay, pause for breath. Part two, assessment. Assessment is the most important thing we do. I would suggest it's the most difficult thing we do, and it's the most challenging thing we do. I think it's going to become even more important over the next 5 to 10 years. And the big question is, do students learn sufficiently from their assessment experience? And in particular, this idea of can they self-evaluate the qualities? And on the bottom right of that slide is a challenge. Ask your students, what are the characteristics of a first-class student? My wager is that they will know the algorithm. They will know what marks they need to go there. But do they know the qualities behind it that make first-classness? It links back to a really interesting session I've just been to about critical thinking and critical analysis and what do things mean. So when we talk about assessment, I think, again, there are lots of opportunities for, as again came out of the panel meeting this morning and came out of the student presentation this morning, lots of opportunities to change assessment. And there's now lots of information about assessment which we can take advantage of. So, for example, both two NTFS group projects, a decade old, but have still actually got lots of stuff in them that can illuminate what we're about. Tester, this came up with the idea of the assessment environment with lots of dimensions. And the finding that they came up with was that if you look at all those characteristics, how much summative assessment there is, how much formative there is on an undergraduate course, the thing they found is the variation. And that the variation was not necessarily to do with subject discipline, but perhaps more to do with the institutional regulations, which is perhaps a little bit, well, should it be that way around, should we say? So you can explore the notion of what is your courses, what is you, and a lot of the things I'm going to say in the next 5-10 minutes are really putting emphasis back on the course team to get together and have a look at. So, for example, the PASS project, we produced this about 2010, and the sad thing is that these are major problems in assessment. We produced this in 2010 based upon discussions with course leaders from various institutions all over the country. And we can still use it today, which is rather sad. What's changed? Do we not need to take a new perspective? So we went in the PASS project to start looking at, and people have mentioned it several times today, this idea of program assessment, this idea of taking a more integrative overall perspective on assessment. And perhaps the best way of representing this is in this diagram. If you think about a particular module, it'll only cover some of the program outcomes, and it'll not be heavily weighted because it's only one module. So it's at the bottom left of this diagram. What happens if we move up the diagram? If we try and develop assessments that cover more of the program outcomes than the single module, and also are more heavily weighted, are more important, are more significant in terms of the final qualification. And on the website, and the link is back a few slides back, you can follow up lots of our examples, because we think that reviewing assessment from this perspective, from a program assessment, can lead to some really valuable new initiatives. So, for example, Pharmacy at Bradford adopted a program perspective. They've now adopted team-based learning. They've revised their timetable. They're using what they call long loop assessment practices. In other words, picking stuff up from year one into year two, and so on, and having a long loop rather than a short loop assessment feedback. They've changed their calendar, and we could spend a whole half hour just going through this, but they've no longer, but because of the notion of bringing things right through the year and bringing things together, they felt the need to change their timetable. They've adopted team-based learning. And if you've never come across team-based learning, there's lots of interesting stuff on that, which is this idea that you present stuff in blocks of about 3 to 5 class meetings. It's a kind of flipped classroom plus testing plus application. And there's some really interesting examples coming out of that. So reviewing your assessment can lead to other things. And our most creative example that came out of the PASS project was Brunel. This was biosciences. And what they did was they made a distinction between study blocks, teaching plus formative assessment, and assessment blocks, and decided they wanted to teach material and then bring it together in assessment. So this was their first course diagram from about 10 years ago, study blocks at the bottom and assessment blocks at the top. And this is their course diagram now. And you'll see that, again, the study blocks are more or less the same as they were 10 years ago. They've changed the exams around a bit, but you'll see that the study comes together. The assessment is all integrative. And you think, well, that's incredibly complex. Can that work? Yes, it does. They've got lots of statistics to show that integrative assessment can be really powerful, can work, can make a dramatic difference. And I'll not talk to this slide, but there's the link to their practical guide. So thinking about programs, a more program perspective, a more integrative perspective, it offers authentic alternatives. It has impact on student identity. And certainly talking to folk from Bradford, we found that readjusting assessments during the pandemic was much easier in courses that had this very clear idea of program outcomes and this very clear idea of how you might assess them. So it's not an immediate solution. It's not a quick overnight fix, but it does have really useful long-term implications. And we're seeing a lot more interest in it of late. Feedback, again, feedback's changed. Feedback has become more important. There's a lot more research on it. There's a lot more literature on it. And there's a really very simple model from Royce Sadler, asking your student, do you know what good work looks like? Do you know what your own work is worth? And do you know how to get from B to A? In other words, from what you're doing now to whatever you want to be in terms of good work. And often we don't have those discussions with students. So there's Naomi Winston and David Carlos. There's their idea of how feedback has changed over time, particularly over the last 5-10 years, that feedback is much more dialogic now. It's about sense making, about helping students to generate comments, to generate ideas, to generate their own self-evaluation. And of course, they've got a book full of ideas of how you might help to give students feedback. And again, one very quick example that's from research that's just come around is from David Nichol, and the link is in the references, which you can see at the end of this, is that he's found and he's researched helping students to make comparisons, to get this idea of inner feedback, the self-evaluation is really important. And the best way of doing that is to get them to make comparisons, because often students don't have the opportunity to compare their own work either with other people's work or an exemplar or something else. You know, how does your work compare with a journal article or some kind of other publication in this sort of area? And simply by introducing that as a formal step, and there's how he does it, there's how some courses have done it, simply by introducing that as a formal step, he and colleagues have made a dramatic difference to the way students respond to and make sense of feedback. So there's all sorts of things going on in assessment feedback that we could pick up on, and there's the wonderful collection of resources from Sally Brown and Kay Samble, which they produced during the pandemic. And there's some summer reading for you when you follow that link. All to the end of this idea of evaluative judgment, helping students make sense for themselves of what they're doing. And I think that's a very different agenda for assessment than what we've been able to do previously. Just pause for a second to pick up on the chat box. Yeah, the questions, a couple of comments there from Joanne and David about this distinction between in-person, online, in-person, and how we construct that blend and how we experience that blend of life, if you like. I think that's one of our challenges for the next year. So the world of work is changing. We can take advantage of that. We could take advantage of all the research and some of the new patterns of assessment, because students are, as we saw this morning, students are actually looking forward to that. And finally, the last few minutes, we can look at new patterns of teaching. And I think there's some really interesting, again, one of the things that came out of the keynote this morning from our students, what do our students expect? I've got two data sets here, which I'll not talk about, but which you can have a look at later. One is from the Student Futures Commission, but this was actually done last month in May. And the most popular option for future teaching on that right-hand side, in person with some online. Now, that's not the impression that I got from the Times Higher Ed this last week, because that was one of their main headlines. And just a couple of comments lifted out of that article from the THE, because I haven't been able to read the whole report. The co-author says, there are questions about university decision to retain online lectures this autumn. In other words, there's, and this comes back to some of the questions we raised in the panel. How could we appropriately incorporate good online teaching into what we do? And what will our students believe? Isn't there that kind of media emphasis on online as not being quite up to scratch? And perhaps they've been told that they shouldn't use their laptops in class. And that is, in fact, nonsense, because there was a research study that showed that, and a lot of people reacted to that, but it's now been discounted. And it's much more complicated, believe it or not, than the original research suggests. And of course, there's now lots of information about where EdTech might be going. And I'll just recommend that book by Martin Weller, but I'll skip over it because I'd really like to ask the question of what EdTech developments do we really need or want, because I've come across a case study that I'd like to talk about. Is this the future? Are we going to the high flex, where we address here, and we also have students perhaps in the room, but we also have students all over the place who might look at this synchronously and then asynchronously? And my final 5 minutes really wants to be a case study of Eric Mazur, because he was he was a traditional didactic teacher who moved to active learning, project-based group work, peer-to-peer instruction. And of course, the pandemic blew that away because he didn't do face-to-face. And he has now become a total convert to online learning. Quote, I've never been able to offer a course of the quality that I'm offering now. And he's talking about a pure online version. So does he offer us a path for the future? Unfortunately, or at least fortunately for him, because it seems to have worked, but he's done at least 7 different things. He's moved to asynchronous. He's moved to self-paced from the point of the student. He's got tutors visiting student teams rather than the other way around. He's got teams changing during the course so that students get different group experiences. He's got an ongoing kind of social support through Slack, multiple low-stakes assignments, and simple grading system. But how and why did it work? And there is at least one counter argument that I found in the literature the other day, which unfortunately I didn't have a chance to get into these slides, but follow it up if you wish. What worked? It worked for him, but is that down to him, or is that down to some of the things that he did? And maybe one of the things we should be thinking about is, what can we incorporate and what can we investigate, perhaps as a course team? Because I think most of what I'm talking about really means that we need to start talking to each other as a course team in ways that perhaps hasn't happened before because of the way we've flung into modularization. And we need that kind of investigative, collaborative approach. And so my final thought is to leave you with an acronym, because every good educational project needs an acronym, and my acronym is CHEERS. I think we should be challenging some of our traditions and assumptions about assessment. We should be engaging, collaborating, integrating. We have an opportunity with students, which maybe we didn't have 2 years ago. And we should be exploring the new realities. So unfortunately, I do have a glass I don't have a glass to hand, but I do have a cup. Cheers.